The artificial lights buzzed faintly overhead as I stepped into the empty elevator, my footsteps echoing in the confined metal space. Just another routine ride to the 14th floor of my downtown Chicago office building, or so I thought. But as the doors slid shut with their familiar mechanical whisper and the elevator began its ascent, the lights flickered once, twice, then died completely, plunging me into absolute darkness. In that suffocating silence, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Breathing that wasn't my own, slow and deliberate, coming from somewhere in the darkness just inches away. But I knew I had entered alone. I had watched the doors close behind me with no one else inside. The breathing grew louder, more labored, as if someone was standing right next to me in the cramped space, sharing the same air, the same terror, the same impossible situation. My name is Michael, and that night taught me that elevators aren't just simple mechanical systems that carry us safely between floors. They're portals to places that shouldn't exist, carrying passengers who shouldn't be there, stopping at floors that were never built. Have you ever pressed a button for the 5th floor and ended up somewhere that doesn't appear on any building directory? Have you ever shared an elevator with people who vanished before the doors opened? Smash that like button if you're ready to discover why some people take the stairs no matter how many flights they have to climb, because tonight I'm sharing 3 true accounts that will make you question every elevator ride you've ever taken. These aren't urban legends designed to make people afraid of elevators. These are real experiences from real people who learned that when you're trapped in a small metal box, suspended between floors, with nowhere to run and nowhere to hide, you can encounter situations that will haunt you for the rest of your life. Sarah thought she understood elevators. As a marketing executive working on the 32nd floor of a prestigious Manhattan office tower, she'd ridden them multiple times daily for over 3 years without ever experiencing problems. The building was a modern skyscraper with state-of-the-art elevator systems, advanced security features, and the kind of high-tech infrastructure designed to make vertical transportation safe and completely reliable for thousands of daily users. The building's elevator system consisted of 8 high-speed cars serving 42 floors, with sophisticated computerized controls that managed traffic flow and provided smooth, quiet rides that were barely noticeable to passengers accustomed to daily vertical commuting. Sarah's routine was predictable. Enter through the main lobby, badge in with security, take an express elevator to the 32nd floor. The ride typically took less than 2 minutes. For over 3 years, these elevator rides had been completely routine and unremarkable, just another part of her daily commute that she barely noticed consciously. The elevators were clean, well-maintained, and equipped with standard safety features including emergency phones, backup power systems, and computerized monitoring designed to detect and prevent mechanical problems before they could affect passenger safety. But on a rainy Tuesday morning in November, Sarah's routine elevator ride became the beginning of an experience that would change her relationship with elevators forever. Sarah entered the lobby at her usual time and approached the elevator bank where several other professionals were waiting. When elevator number 6 arrived, she stepped inside along with 4 other passengers, 2 businessmen, a woman in her 50s who looked like a senior executive, and a younger man who might have been an intern. The elevator car was spacious and well lit, with polished metal walls, a digital floor display, and the quiet, efficient atmosphere that characterized modern office building elevators. Sarah pressed the button for the 32nd floor and positioned herself near the back of the car. The other passengers had pressed buttons for various floors between the 15th and 40th levels, creating a typical morning elevator ride with multiple stops. The elevator began its ascent smoothly, making its first stop at the 15th floor, where one businessman exited without incident. The doors closed normally, and the elevator continued upward, stopping at the 22nd floor where the woman executive stepped out. Everything was proceeding exactly as Sarah expected. With the familiar rhythm of stops and passenger exits, that characterized thousands of similar rides. But as the elevator continued past the 25th floor, something began to go wrong in ways that defied Sarah's understanding of how elevators were supposed to function. The smooth ascent became jerky and irregular, with sudden stops and starts that weren't related to scheduled floor stops or normal passenger activities. The digital floor display began showing numbers that didn't correspond to the building's actual layout. Floors in the 50s and 60s, then counting backward through negative numbers as if the elevator was traveling to basement levels that didn't exist in the 42-story building's architectural plans. The lighting inside the elevator car began to flicker and dim, creating an atmosphere of uncertainty that made the remaining passengers increasingly nervous. Sarah pressed the emergency call button, but instead of connecting to building security, the intercom produced a sound that made her blood run cold. Instead of a familiar security guard's voice, the intercom emitted what sounded like multiple people talking at once, but the voices were distorted and unintelligible, creating a cacophony that seemed to come from somewhere far away or from a different time period entirely. The voices had a quality suggesting people in distress, but the words were too garbled to understand what they were trying to communicate. Ring that notification bell if you've ever heard voices coming from places where no voices should exist, because what Sarah discovered about her fellow passengers proved that some elevator rides pick up more than just people from the lobby. As the elevator continued its erratic behavior, stopping and starting at random intervals without opening doors or allowing passengers to exit, Sarah began to notice that her fellow passengers were behaving in ways that didn't match their initial reactions to the malfunction. The businessman who had remained after the 22nd floor was standing perfectly still, staring straight ahead with a blank expression suggesting he was no longer aware of his surroundings. The young intern had positioned himself in the corner and was mumbling to himself in a voice too quiet to understand, but his body language suggested fear and confusion that went beyond normal concern about elevator malfunctions. Both men seemed to be responding to something Sarah couldn't see or hear, as if they were experiencing a different version of the malfunction that involved elements invisible to her. Sarah tried to get their attention and discuss what they should do, but neither man responded to her questions or seemed aware she was speaking. They appeared trapped in their own individual experiences, unable to communicate with each other or coordinate responses to the increasingly disturbing situation. The elevator's movement became more violent and unpredictable, with sudden drops and rapid ascents that felt like the car was falling or being pulled upward by forces that had nothing to do with normal elevator mechanics. Sarah could feel her stomach dropping during the sudden movements, and she had to brace herself against the walls to avoid being thrown around the car. The digital floor display continued showing impossible numbers and symbols that didn't correspond to any building layout Sarah had ever encountered. Sometimes the display would show letters instead of numbers, spelling out words that seemed to be names or locations, with no connection to the office building where she worked. The most disturbing aspect was the gradual realization that time seemed to be passing differently inside the elevator car. Sarah's watch indicated she'd been trapped for over an hour, which was impossible given that her commute normally took less than 2 minutes. And even serious malfunctions should have been resolved by building maintenance within 20 minutes at most. The prolonged duration suggested something was happening that went beyond normal mechanical problems, something affecting the fundamental nature of time and space inside the elevator car in ways that defied rational explanation. Sarah began to feel trapped, not just physically in a malfunctioning elevator, but temporally in a situation that existed outside normal time and space. The situation reached crisis when Sarah realized the other passengers were no longer behaving like living people, but were exhibiting repetitive mechanical behavior suggesting they'd become part of whatever was causing the elevator to malfunction. The businessman was moving his mouth as if speaking, but no sound was coming out, and his facial expression remained completely blank. The intern had begun making repetitive gestures with his hands, as if trying to press elevator buttons or operate controls that weren't visible to Sarah, but his movements were mechanical and purposeless, like someone going through familiar motions without understanding their meaning. Both men seemed to have lost their individual personalities and consciousness, becoming part of the elevator's malfunctioning system rather than passengers experiencing technical difficulties. Sarah's escape came suddenly and without explanation when the doors opened at what the display indicated was the 32nd floor, even though the car's erratic behavior suggested she was nowhere near her intended destination. The hallway beyond looked exactly like the 32nd floor of her office building, with familiar carpeting, lighting, and office doors she recognized. But when Sarah stepped out and turned back to look at the car she'd just exited, she discovered the other two passengers were no longer inside. The elevator car was completely empty, as if the businessman and intern had never been there at all, despite the fact that Sarah had been watching them throughout the entire malfunction. Sarah reported the incident to building security, describing the erratic behavior, impossible floor readings, and disappearing passengers. But when maintenance checked the elevator's computerized logs, they found no record of any malfunction during the time period when Sarah claimed to have been trapped. According to the building's monitoring system, elevator number 6 had operated normally throughout the morning, making routine stops without any technical problems. The maintenance staff suggested Sarah might have experienced some kind of medical episode that affected her perception, but they couldn't explain the specific technical details of her account. Sarah never rode elevator number 6 again, choosing stairs or other cars rather than risk another incident that challenged her understanding of reality. She learned later that other tenants had reported similar experiences: impossible floor readings, missing passengers, and time distortions suggesting the elevator was somehow operating outside normal physical laws. But if you think disappearing passengers represent the worst thing that can happen in an elevator, wait until you hear what Marcus discovered during his night security rounds in Detroit. Because sometimes elevators don't just malfunction. They transport you to places that were never supposed to exist, floors that don't appear on any building plans, and spaces where time moves according to different rules entirely. Marcus had been working security in office buildings for over 15 years, and he was familiar with the kinds of mechanical problems and unusual incidents that could occur in older buildings with aging infrastructure. The 20-story Detroit office building where he worked had been constructed in the 1960s and renovated multiple times to maintain its competitiveness in the commercial real estate market. The building had 4 elevator cars serving 20 floors, with 2 designated for passenger use during business hours and 2 primarily used for freight and maintenance. The elevator system was older than modern computerized systems, but had been regularly maintained and updated with safety features meeting current building codes. Marcus's duties included conducting regular patrols during overnight hours, checking that all floors were secure, and building systems were operating normally when the building was largely empty except for cleaning crews and occasional late-working tenants. The elevator system was typically shut down overnight except for 1 car that remained operational for security and emergency use. For over 2 years, Marcus had used the overnight elevator without problems, riding it multiple times each night during security rounds. The elevator was reliable and predictable, with mechanical controls that were simple and straightforward compared to computerized systems in newer buildings. But on a cold February night, Marcus's routine security patrol became the beginning of an experience that would challenge his understanding of building systems and make him question the safety of the elevator he'd been using without incident for over 2 years. Marcus was conducting his midnight patrol, starting from the ground floor and working his way up systematically to check each floor and ensure all office suites were secure. He entered the elevator and pressed the button for the 2nd floor, planning to begin with lower floors and work upward in his usual manner. The elevator responded normally, beginning its ascent with familiar mechanical sounds and smooth operation Marcus had experienced hundreds of times. But as the elevator passed the 1st floor and continued toward the 2nd, Marcus noticed the floor indicator wasn't advancing normally and the elevator seemed to be taking much longer than usual to travel between floors. The mechanical sounds also seemed different, with grinding and creaking noises suggesting mechanical stress or system problems Marcus had never heard during previous use. When the elevator finally stopped and doors opened, Marcus discovered he wasn't on the second floor as intended, but in what appeared to be a basement level he'd never seen before, and that didn't correspond to the building's architectural plans or his knowledge of the building's layout. Hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments if you've ever found yourself somewhere that shouldn't exist, because what Marcus discovered in that basement level proved that some buildings have more floors than their architects ever designed. The hallway beyond the elevator doors was dimly lit and had a different architectural style than the rest of the building, with older fixtures, different flooring materials, and a musty smell suggesting the space had been unused for a long time. Marcus was confused by this unexpected destination, since he knew the building had only a small mechanical basement, not accessible by passenger elevators, and requiring special key access through a separate service entrance. The space appeared to be a full basement level with multiple rooms and corridors, suggesting it had once been used for office or commercial purposes. But it wasn't part of the building layout Marcus had been trained on or that appeared in official floor plans. Marcus decided to investigate this unexpected basement level, thinking it might be a part of the building that had been forgotten during his security training and that he should document for building management. He stepped out and began exploring the dimly lit corridors, looking for light switches, room numbers, or identifying features that would help him understand what this space was. The basement appeared to contain multiple office suites and meeting rooms furnished with desks, chairs, and office equipment that looked like it dated from several decades earlier, as if the space had been abandoned in the 1980s or 1990s and left exactly as it was when the last tenants moved out. The furniture was covered with dust and showed signs of long-term neglect, but it was still in good condition and appeared to have been high quality when new. As Marcus explored the abandoned basement offices, he began finding evidence that the space had been occupied much more recently than the dusty furniture would suggest. There were coffee cups on desks that still contained liquid, newspapers dated from the current week, and computer screens still glowing with active displays, as if people had been working just moments before Marcus arrived and had stepped away temporarily. The contradiction between obvious signs of long-term abandonment and evidence of recent occupancy was disturbing and confusing, suggesting Marcus had discovered something that didn't fit with normal understanding of how office spaces were used and maintained. The basement seemed to exist in multiple time periods simultaneously, with some elements suggesting decades of neglect, while others indicated current active use by people who were somehow invisible whenever Marcus was present. Marcus's exploration was interrupted when he heard the elevator doors closing behind him, even though he hadn't pressed any buttons or called for the elevator to return to another floor. When he turned back toward the elevator, he discovered the car had left without him, leaving him stranded in the basement level with no obvious way to return to the ground floor or continue his security patrol. Marcus searched for alternative exits, stairwells, service elevators, or emergency exits that would allow him to return to the main building levels. But he found no other means of egress. The space seemed completely isolated from the rest of the building, accessible only through the passenger elevator that had brought him there and then abandoned him. As Marcus continued searching for a way out, he began hearing sounds suggesting the abandoned offices weren't as empty as they appeared. He could hear faint typing, telephone conversations, and office equipment operating, as if the abandoned workspace was somehow still active and occupied by people invisible to Marcus, but continuing to conduct business in the forgotten basement level. The sounds became more distinct as Marcus spent more time in the basement, and he began catching glimpses of movement in his peripheral vision, as if people were moving through corridors and offices just outside his direct line of sight. When Marcus tried to approach these sources of sound and movement, they would stop or move to different locations, creating a pattern of activity that seemed deliberately to avoid direct contact while maintaining constant presence throughout the basement. Marcus's situation became desperate as hours passed, and he remained trapped with no way to contact the outside world or return to his security duties. His radio and cell phone had no signal in the basement area, and he found no working telephones or communication equipment that would allow him to call for help. Marcus's escape came suddenly when the elevator doors opened behind him, even though he hadn't heard the car arrive or pressed any buttons to summon it. The elevator appeared to be the same one that had brought him to the basement, but when Marcus stepped inside and looked at the control panel, he discovered there was no button for the basement level he'd just left, and the floor indicator showed he was on the ground floor, as if he'd never left that level at all. When the doors opened on the ground floor, Marcus found himself back in the familiar lobby with no evidence he'd spent hours trapped in a mysterious basement. His watch indicated only a few minutes had passed since he'd first entered the elevator, even though his subjective experience suggested he'd been trapped for several hours. Marcus reported his experience to building management and requested access to architectural plans to verify the existence of the basement level he'd discovered. But according to all official records, the building had no basement level beyond a small mechanical room not accessible by passenger elevator, and there was no evidence the space Marcus described had ever existed. But even mysterious basement levels that exist outside of time seem almost rational compared to what Jennifer discovered during her night shift at a Los Angeles hospital. Because sometimes elevators don't just take you to the wrong floor, they transport you to the wrong decade, where medical practices from the past continue in spaces that should no longer exist. Jennifer was a medical resident working at a large Los Angeles hospital that occupied a complex of interconnected buildings from different construction periods. The hospital's elevator system was extensive and complex, with multiple banks serving different wings and departments, including passenger elevators for visitors and staff, service elevators for equipment, and specialized elevators for transporting patients. Jennifer had been working at the hospital for over a year as part of her emergency medicine residency training, and she was familiar with the building's layout and elevator systems from her daily routine of moving between departments and medical facilities throughout the complex. The elevators were heavily used around the clock, with constant traffic from medical staff, patients, visitors, and support personnel. The system included both modern computerized cars in newer wings and older mechanical elevators in original building sections constructed in the 1950s and 1960s. Jennifer typically used whichever elevators were most convenient for her destination and had never experienced problems with any of the hospital's vertical transportation systems. But during a particularly busy night shift in the emergency department, Jennifer's routine elevator use became the beginning of an experience that would challenge her medical training and scientific understanding of how mechanical systems and human psychology interact in high-stress environments. Jennifer was responding to a code blue emergency on the 8th floor, where a patient was experiencing cardiac arrest and needed immediate medical intervention from the emergency response team. She entered one of the older elevators in the original hospital building, pressing the button for the 8th floor and expecting the quick, efficient ride that would get her to the emergency scene as rapidly as possible. The elevator was one of the mechanical models from the hospital's earlier construction period, with manual controls and older safety systems that were still functional and regularly maintained, but lacked computerized features found in newer installations. As the elevator began its ascent toward the 8th floor, Jennifer noticed the car was moving more slowly than usual, and the mechanical sound seemed louder and more labored than she remembered. The floor indicator was advancing normally, but the elevator seemed to be taking much longer than usual to travel between floors, creating a delay that was concerning, given the urgent nature of the medical emergency. When the elevator reached what the indicator showed as the 8th floor, the doors opened to reveal a corridor Jennifer didn't recognize, despite her extensive familiarity with the hospital's layout and frequent visits to the 8th floor for patient care and medical consultations. Share this video with someone who works in healthcare, because what Jennifer discovered about this alternate hospital floor challenges everything we think we know about medical facilities and the nature of time itself. The hallway beyond the elevator doors had different lighting, flooring, and architectural features than the 8th floor she knew, and it had an institutional atmosphere. That seemed older and more austere than the modern hospital environment she was accustomed to working in. Jennifer was confused by this unexpected destination, thinking she might have accidentally pressed the wrong button or that the elevator's floor indicator was malfunctioning. She checked the control panel to verify she'd pressed the correct button and looked for floor numbers or directional signs that would help her determine where she was. But as Jennifer explored the unfamiliar corridor, she began to realize she wasn't simply on the wrong floor of the hospital, but in what appeared to be a completely different medical facility with architectural features and design elements from an earlier era of hospital construction and medical practice. The corridor was lined with patient rooms containing medical equipment and furnishings that looked like they dated from several decades earlier, with metal bed frames, older monitoring equipment, and institutional furniture reflecting medical practices and hospital design from the 1960s or 1970s. The patient rooms were occupied by people who appeared to be receiving medical care, but their conditions and treatments did not match current medical practices or the types of cases Jennifer was familiar with from her emergency medicine training. The patients seemed to be suffering from diseases and medical conditions rarely seen in modern hospitals, and they were being treated with procedures and equipment that had been superseded by more advanced techniques decades earlier. Jennifer's medical training told her she should offer assistance to the patients and medical staff in this unfamiliar hospital environment. But when she tried to approach the patient rooms and introduce herself to the medical personnel providing care, she discovered they couldn't see or hear her, as if she was invisible to everyone in this alternate version of the hospital. The medical staff continued their work without acknowledging Jennifer's presence, even when she spoke directly to them or tried to get their attention. The patients also seemed unaware of her presence, continuing to interact with their caregivers and respond to treatments without showing any sign they could see or hear Jennifer, despite her obvious presence in their rooms and corridors. Jennifer's attempts to understand her situation and find a way back to the familiar hospital environment, where she was supposed to be responding to a medical emergency, were complicated by the realization that time seemed to be passing differently in this alternate hospital. Her pager and cell phone indicated hours had passed since she'd entered the elevator, which was impossible given that elevator rides typically took less than a minute and medical emergencies required immediate response. She began encountering medical situations and patient conditions that were disturbing and historically significant in ways that suggested she was witnessing medical practices from earlier eras when treatment options were more limited and patient outcomes were often poor due to technological limitations and incomplete understanding of disease processes. She observed surgical procedures being performed with techniques and equipment that had been abandoned decades earlier due to safety concerns and the development of more effective treatment methods, and she saw patients suffering from diseases that had been largely eliminated in modern medical practice through vaccination programs, improved sanitation, and advanced pharmaceutical interventions. The medical staff in this alternate hospital environment seemed dedicated and competent according to the standards and knowledge available during their historical period, but their treatments and procedures were often ineffective or even harmful according to current medical understanding and evidence-based practice guidelines that Jennifer had learned during her training. Jennifer's medical training created a moral dilemma as she watched patients receiving substandard care according to modern standards, but she was unable to intervene due to her invisible status. She felt professionally and ethically obligated to help patients who were suffering and to correct medical practices she knew were outdated and potentially harmful. But she had no way to communicate with the medical staff or influence the care being provided. Jennifer's escape from the alternate hospital environment came suddenly when she found herself back in the familiar elevator, with doors opening on the 8th floor of her own hospital, where the code blue emergency was still in progress and medical staff were waiting for her arrival to assist with patient care. According to the hospital's emergency response protocols, only a few minutes had passed since the code blue had been called, even though Jennifer's subjective experience suggested she'd been trapped in the alternate hospital for several hours. Jennifer joined the medical team responding to the cardiac arrest emergency, but she was distracted and disturbed by her experience and her inability to explain what had happened during her elevator ride or why she'd been delayed. Her medical colleagues noticed she seemed shaken and disoriented, but they attributed her condition to the stress of emergency medical work and the demanding schedule of residency training. Jennifer reported her experience to hospital administration and requested information about the hospital's history and previous medical facilities that might have occupied the same location. She learned that the hospital had been built on the site of an earlier medical facility that had operated from the 1950s through the 1980s, providing medical care according to the standards of those earlier decades before being demolished and replaced with the modern hospital where she worked. The earlier hospital had been known for treating patients with diseases and conditions that were common during the mid-20th century but had become rare or extinct due to medical advances and public health improvements. Jennifer realized that her experience had somehow connected her to the medical history of the location where she worked, allowing her to witness medical practices and patient care from an earlier era when treatment options were more limited and patient outcomes were often tragic. These 3 accounts from elevators across America reveal a disturbing truth about the mechanical systems we trust with our lives every day. The small enclosed spaces that carry us safely between floors can become stages for encounters that challenge our understanding of physics, time, and reality itself. Sarah's experience with disappearing passengers and impossible floor readings in Manhattan, Marcus's discovery of a basement level that shouldn't exist in Detroit, and Jennifer's journey to an alternate hospital from an earlier era in Los Angeles all demonstrate that elevators, despite their familiar appearance and routine function, can transport us to places and times that exist outside normal understanding. These are real experiences from real people who learned that when you step into an elevator and press a button for your destination, you can never be completely certain where you will end up or what you will encounter during the journey between floors. The most chilling aspect of these accounts is not the supernatural activities themselves. It's the realization that in each case, the victims had no way of knowing what they were facing until they were already trapped in situations where escape required luck, quick thinking, or forces beyond their control. Sarah had no warning that her routine morning commute would trap her in an elevator with passengers who gradually lost their humanity and became part of the machine itself. Marcus had no indication that his security patrol would lead him to a basement level that existed in multiple time periods, simultaneously where the past and present coexisted in ways that defied architectural logic. Jennifer had no clue that her emergency response would transport her to a hospital from decades past, where she could witness medical history but was powerless to intervene or help patients suffering under outdated treatment protocols. If you're currently using elevators regularly in office buildings, hospitals, or apartment complexes, if you've ever experienced unexplained delays or mechanical problems, or if you've sensed that something wasn't quite right about your destination when the doors opened, trust your instincts. Subscribe and ring that notification bell if these stories have opened your eyes to dangers you never considered. And remember that sometimes the most ordinary activities can lead to the most extraordinary and terrifying experiences. Drop a comment below if you've experienced anything that made you question the reliability of elevator systems, because sharing our experiences might be the only thing standing between other passengers and situations that exist outside the normal rules of time, space, and mechanical engineering. The next time you step into an elevator and press a button for your floor, remember these stories and pay attention to the floor indicator, the sounds of the machinery, and the faces of your fellow passengers. Before you go, check out the playlist in the description for more true building horror stories, that will change how you see urban architecture forever. Because in the end, the most terrifying realization isn't that these things happened, it's that they're still happening right now in elevators across the country, to passengers who have no idea that their routine vertical journey might become a trip to somewhere that doesn't appear on any building directory. Pleasant nightmares. And remember, the next time you're alone in an elevator and it stops at a floor you didn't press, ask yourself if you really want to see what's waiting beyond those doors. Because sometimes the most dangerous destinations are the ones that were never supposed to exist, and the passengers who get off at those floors might never find their way back to the world they know.